Coming up in this episode of the Magic Book Podcast.
As someone who for years before I knew I would be in this field, I was a customer of these magic shops and bookshops, and I know which ones I liked and which ones I didn't. And so I just basically try to emulate the ones that I liked and look at it from the customer's viewpoint.
You're listening to the Magic Book Podcast. Conversations about classic and contemporary books that teach, illuminate and celebrate the art of magic. I'm your host, Adrian Tennant, a lifetime student of magic and mentalism, occasional performer and long-time book collector. Thanks for joining me. Welcome to the 9th episode of the Magic Book Podcast. Today, my guest is Philip David Treece, a magic historian, publisher and bookseller who's made significant contributions to documenting and preserving magic's printed heritage. As the founder of CollectingMagicBooks.com, Philip curates an extensive collection of magic books, from contemporary releases to rare antiquarian volumes. His own published works include Ernest Sewell and the London Magical Co., and the 2-volume Ellisdon's The History, which chronicles one of London's most iconic magic and joke shops. Philip's background as a trained conservator brings unique insights to his work preserving and sharing magic history. The essay he wrote for Magic Papers explored conjuring book design from 1890 to 1960, celebrating the artistry of magic publishing during this golden age. Through his writing and publishing, Philip helps keep alive the rich history of magic manufacturing and publishing. Philip, welcome to the Magic Book Podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Can you tell us about your first exposure to magic?
It would have been the Paul Daniels Magic Show, which in the UK was a huge institution. It went on for years and years. And when I was a toddler, it was just coming to an end. So I caught it probably the last couple of series. And for my 4th birthday, I got the Paul Daniels Magic set, which they must have produced millions of. They're the start of many, many magicians' careers and magic hobbyists' careers and things. So yes, it was that magic set when I was 4 years old.
Well, excluding the instruction manual that accompanied that Paul Daniels magic set, do you remember your first magic book?
Yeah, well, I think I do. When I got into it, my parents were very into books already, so we pretty much bought anything in any jumble sale or charity shop. And I think the first one was Ali Bongo's book, Be a Magician. Ali Bongo was the creative mind, well, one of them behind the Paul Daniels Magic Show, so there's a connection there. It's a really lovely book. I've still got it, and it has lots of good effects in, and it also has all of the interesting behind-the-scenes theory and talks about magic shops and talks about publishers and things. So it was a very nice start.
You trained to work in conservation, which you've done professionally for many years. I think I mentioned this to you when we were preparing for this podcast, but I recall seeing an advertisement you placed in Magical magazine in around 2012, I think, offering prop and object restoration services. So I'm curious, was that a gateway into the magic collecting community?
I don't think it was. I think the things ran parallel, really. I'd already started collecting before I was studying to be a conservator. And then I specialised. For my undergraduate, I did a magic set, a Bland's magic set for my sort of final piece. And for my master's, I also did a large piece on the unique problems that magic collections have compared to a standard museum collection. So I was already seeing if that field would be something I could work in. And I did a few bits, but the market's just not big enough, really. So I moved into more standard conservation. But I was already collecting before that, and it just was a nice fit.
You mentioned, was it a Bland's magic set?
Yes, there's only a couple in existence, I think. So it's like the large Hamleys magic set, professional magic sets that were made, so filled with German and French apparatus. And they were originally Bland's sets that I think they were produced by Hamleys as well, but obviously Hamleys bought Bland. So it's a huge box. It's filled with lovely turned German apparatus and stuff. So that was my main piece of my undergraduate. And then weirdly, just last year, I was offered the very same set, but in more complete condition. So when I say I only know of 2, I am lucky enough to have both. But yeah, which is funny because I don't have any of the Hamleys ones, but there you go.
Oh, that's amazing. In 2020, you collaborated with Patrick Fry on a book called Magic Papers. Patrick is well known for publishing books about unusual collections. So, Philip, how did your partnership develop?
Well, he approached me, so he'd already done 2 of these books, one about unusual house bricks and another about a very interesting collection of ephemeral items, so yogurt pots and things like that, so quite unusual things. And he'd found me on Twitter, I think it was, just while looking around at unusual collections and things. I think it helped that my blog was called Collecting Magic, so I think there was already something that probably just he found through that. So he came for a day, and at the time he didn't know what he was going to concentrate on, whether it would be magic packaging, because I have my sort of main collecting area is early magic and joke novelties, things like that. He was sort of thinking more about doing Elliston's packaging, which is a novelty company, which I'm sure we'll get onto. But instead he thought that the real variety was in the printed material, and that was what the book ended up being about. Magic booklets and magazines and books from kind of the golden age of publishing in magic.
Magic Papers features items from your personal collection. And in your essay, you write about how magic publishing thrived between 1890 and 1960. What made this period so significant, do you think?
I think it was 2 things combining. One was the rise of magic as a concert party entertainment. So people having private parties, people having smaller events. So the idea of the semi-amateur and amateur magician becoming a big thing in the UK particularly. So those amateurs, to supplement their income, would often sell tricks and sell books. And then the second thing that kind of combined with that, I think, was the cheapness of printing and publishing at that time. It got a lot cheaper very quickly. And as you move into the 20th century, cheap methods of printing for yourself as well, with things like Banda printing methods and even cheap printing presses. Davenport's bought their own printing press. They printed their own magazines, their own booklets, as did many other publishers. They were actually doing it in-house. I mean, even Supreme Magic, as late as the 60s, were printing their own in-house stuff. They weren't subcontracting out to printers. So I think those things combined. Actually, I saw someone mention the other day how magic publishing has changed so much with the ability to quickly and easily self-publish. Now, that's always been a huge chunk of magic publishing, has been self-publishing, either at your local printers for very cheap or doing it yourself. And that, I guess that period from 1890 through to 1930-40 was when that really happened.
In Magic Papers, you observe that many magic publishers were led by one person, each with different priorities and tastes. These included Percy Tibbles, also known as Selbit, of course, Will Goldston, Harry Leet, Percy Noldret, one of my favourites, Eric C. Lewis, and Edward Bagshaw. Philip, how did what we now call self-publishing shape how magic was shared during that period, would you say?
Well, I think it was just that. It was independent. It wasn't controlled. It didn't have to be commercial, which meant that you got very creative ideas that might have been turned down by a bigger magic shop, still being printed. It didn't have to be popular. And often it was controversial. You had, as you mentioned, Goldston, for instance, had a very opinionated approach to a lot of things and rubbed people up the wrong way quite often, as did Harry Leet, who was printing all of his own stuff. And that also created a kind of energy in the magic community, I think, and did lead to a big growth. I mean, for instance, when Will Goldston was making some of the most beautifully produced magic publications with some of the best artists at the time, artists who worked for major magazines at the time, and artists who illustrated Sherlock Holmes stories, for their day job, those things were done out of competition, out of fierce competition. And he was using big department store money. He wasn't using his own money. He was using big department store money from Gamages to get them made. And I think without these strong characters pushing forward their own agendas, we'd have a much less interesting archive of magic literature to look at.
Well, as you mentioned, you also write about the illustrators whose artwork gave books published during the Golden Age their distinctive visual style. Some were able to leverage family connections, like Selbit, whose brother Sidney brought his skills to Percy's books. Philip, do you have any favourite authors or publications in your collection?
Well, the Goldston stuff I do really enjoy looking at. maybe more for its appearance and enjoyable content. A lot of the tricks in it were never built and never worked. He was quite he liked to imagine things often. I think in terms of what I use, I go to the most day to day, more from a magic history angle. It would be Fergus Roy's more recent books. The Davenport Story, it's called, this series of 4 books, which don't just encompass the Davenports. They cover every other business going on that they were involved in at the time. So that's an incredible resource. And I'm trying to think of other, in terms of practical magic books that I enjoy reading, I'm extremely old-fashioned. I really like the Bruce Eliot books. Although they're made for a popular audience, they're incredibly practical. They're very well described and they're beautifully illustrated as well. And I think they're probably the predominant books that I'd enjoy going to rather than just for work.
Do you have the Fergus Roy follow-up about Will Goldston?
Yes, I do. Yes. Yeah.
That's a good read.
It is. It's brilliant. Yeah.
Well, in 2020, you founded collectingmagicbooks.com. So, Philip, what prompted you to establish a magic book business?
It was a few things. I was already, as a collector of magic books myself, I was already selling duplicates I had. It's on a casual basis to try and keep on top of the space. And I was doing that through Etsy, which is extremely cost inefficient. They take a big wedge of your money when you sell that way. So when I had to stop working as a conservator during 2020, as a lot of people's jobs had to change during 2020, and it was an enforced period of time, which I would never get the opportunity to have again, really, as horrible as it was in most other ways. There was an opportunity there to begin selling my own books on my own website and taking more control over it. So that's all it initially started as, was just me thinking about a way of getting rid of my own books. I'd already published the Ernest Sewell book, my first book on magic history. I'd already published that just privately, not through a separate website. And I was thinking about whether it'd be worth writing another one. Then I thought, well, maybe this is a good place to start building an actual shop, having my own publications on there, perhaps having reprints of books on there. And then I started getting relationships going with wholesalers, our main UK general wholesalers. So for the books you could buy at your high street bookshop, as well as the magic publishers and specialists. And gradually, over 2020, I decided it should just be as complete as possible, a bookshop, new and old. That was the only year I would have been able to try such a project. And thankfully, it's worked.
It certainly has. Fast forward to 2024. Could you give us an overview of what people can expect to find on the website?
Yes, it's all split up and compartmentalized either into the era of the book. So you've got new books and they're split to new instructional, new magic history, or you've got your used, your vintage and your antique books. So just essentially a simple way of splitting them by age in case you have a specific interest in that field. And then I also do it by subject matter. So if you're just looking for biographies, you can go on that and it'll put all your new and used biographies. And Coin Magic, for instance, it'll have those books together. So I aim to have more or less all good books that are currently in print and available. Obviously, I can't get everything. Some people have exclusivity and things. And I also try and keep people interested in different fields of used books and vintage and antique books. I try and represent everything I can there. Obviously, you can't always control what you get in and out. What comes in varies a lot. But I'm coming up to something like 2,000 or 3,000 books in stock. And then I've got ready to come into stock as I gradually chip through it, a few more thousand. So it just keep growing every year by 300 or 400 books. And that's even accounting for obviously the ones that sell and go out, So yeah, if you like magic books, then hopefully you'll find something there.
Well, I'm sure running an online magic bookshop comes with some unique challenges, but how do you manage the logistics of storing and organising those thousands of books?
Well, with difficulty, I guess is the quick answer. But you have to be very disciplined. So every book has its place. So if an order comes in, I can go straight to it. That's the most important thing. And I've just reshelved my main storeroom. Good shelving is very important to be able to access everything easily. And I do currently have storage as well. I have a storage unit that is nearby. So that's not ideal, but I try and keep the stuff that's not yet in stock there. So everything that's on the website that you can see is always in stock physically with me. So it will be easy enough to get that. But we are moving to a bigger house next year for this very reason. We didn't buy this house with the intention of having a magic bookshop in it. But that's what we've got. Hmm.
How do you acquire the previously owned books you sell at collectingmagicbooks.com?
A few places. We've bought up quite a few whole estates when magicians have passed away. And I've bought one which was a Magic Society that wanted to get rid of its library. That's when the big lots come in. And I also have quite a lot of customers who will, when they want to thin out areas of their collection, will get in touch directly, and we can usually work something out there. And I do buy individual books at auction from other book dealers as well. Like quite a few of the bigger book dealers will approach me sometimes when they don't want to sell the stuff where they've got too much in at once or whatever. I just recently, a few weeks ago, went to Hay-on-Wye and came back with a few hundred books from there. But Hay-on-Wye for Americanness is a big, huge book town in Wales. And so it's at all sorts of places, really.
I know this can be something of a hot topic, judging from certain Facebook communities. Mm-hmm. What's your approach to pricing previously owned magic books?
Well, there's a few things I look at. I keep a record of all titles. So every time a book sells, the condition, the edition is recorded with the price. I'm not looking for maximum profit. I'm looking for happy customers who are going to come back to me. That's my key thing. As someone who for years before I knew I would be in this field, I was a customer of these magic shops and bookshops, and I know which ones I liked and which ones I didn't. And so I just basically try to emulate the ones that I liked and look at it from the customer's viewpoint. And so, I don't tend to rely on Abe and other online sites for values because it's a bit of a boring fact, but a lot of them use this algorithmic things where they price off other books that are listed. So if, for instance, a bookseller decides to set their book at 5% more for one title than their rival, and their rival does exactly the same, the book will increase. Both books will then bounce off each other, increasing the book. And that's why sometimes when you search for a book, that there'll be one copy or two copies on Abe, and there'll be £1,000 each. You'll be like, well, that doesn't make any sense. It came out 2 years ago, and it was £10. But there's these funny things that go on in that Abe and Amazon world of used books. But there's also a lot of very good book dealers who I will reference with, as I'm sure they do with me. It's about fairness. Ultimately, it's about making sure that people come back. I just don't want people to feel ripped off. I mean, there are valuable books on my site. There are expensive books on my site. So there will be things. And obviously, sometimes you get a very good price on Facebook, maybe on eBay, that you can get bargains. That doesn't mean that when a professional company that's packaging things right, doing things correctly, running the customer service, all the rest, that doesn't mean that they can match those prices always. You're not just paying for the book, you're paying for the service as well. And so there are, and I've said 100 times, nothing has a set value. A cynic might say the price is whatever anyone's willing to pay for it, but that's obviously not always true either, because you might have the book on the shelf for 10 years if you've got a silly price on it. So it's a lot of things. I think it's a hot topic for good reason as well, because people do sometimes push things a bit. And I'm as irritated by that as my customers, I think. But yes, so it's not a straightforward answer.
This is an audio-only podcast, so people can't see your packing table over your shoulder. But as somebody who has bought books from you and had them delivered to me in the States, I can attest to the fantastic packaging, and everything arrives in pristine condition, which is amazing in and of itself in this day and age. But well done. Good job with the packaging.
No, thank you. It is something that is one of the main focuses, to be honest. It's probably 20% of my time is packaging books. But that's just because as a customer, so often you'd buy a book and it would be dropped in a little plastic bag with nothing, just put through the post, and would come dented and bashed or worse. And there's nothing worse than that.
If you're enjoying this episode of the Magic Book Podcast, please consider leaving a rating on Spotify or a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also follow the Magic Book Podcast page on Facebook. Thanks. Philip, let's talk about your 2-volume history of Ellisdon's, published in 2022. Now, Ellisdon's was an iconic London mail-order magic and joke shop. Notable magicians who were regulars included Tommy Cooper, Tony Corinda, and Alex Elmsley. So what drew you to telling the Ellisdon story?
It was mainly how little had been written about Ellisdon's. I think the main catalyst for me was Fergus Roy's book on Davenports and how brilliant they were and how thorough they were. And I just realised Elliston's was not represented, certainly in magic history, it was not represented at all. really, aside from Fergus Roy mentioning it, and many magicians mentioning it as the way they got into magic, because Elliston's sold into Woolworths, the UK version of Woolworths, which was a global chain. It's now gone in the UK. But they've sold these extremely affordable tricks. The first time probably that working class people could buy their children these magic tricks. And so they had a huge influence on creating the magic world we have today in the UK. And many people reference them as their start. But yes, it has kind of been ignored, or not deliberately ignored, but just, because I think they didn't have a very strong market with professional magicians, it's often been overlooked, even though many, as you mentioned, many professional magicians did go to their magic department in London, where there was much more of a community going to see, Alex Elmsley and people like that work there. And, he didn't work there, but he was a regular there. And he developed the Elmsley Count there with Delvin. So there's a lot of people crossing over in the London magic scene in Elliston's, but that's often been forgotten. I thought it was worth writing about as well, because I thought it had a wider appeal than just magic historians and magic people who like reading magic history. The American equivalent would be Adams, S.S. Adams. And there've been 2 books, I believe, written about Adams, so that is something that was just lacking here in the UK for Elliston's.
Well, I understand they started in New Zealand, grew the business in Australia, but then a scandal led to the family moving to London. So how did you research their story?
I was very fortunate that both the New Zealand and the Australian governments have the foresight to have their digital newspaper archives online for free, which is not something we have in the UK. We have to pay to view our newspaper archives. So a lot of it was there online, but it did require literally reading every single excerpt about Elliston's, which took a huge amount of time. And so yes, it was mainly through that newspaper archive that I got the information. And the family, they used to be very diplomatic. The family were lovely and very communicative. I'd have since enjoyed the book and read the book, but I think they were understandably a little bit reluctant to engage at the very start of it because they didn't know who I was. And it was also a very stressful time in terms of COVID happening, and so lots of stuff was going on. So I didn't have anything to go on from the family on those early years. And it is very important to say, I always try and make the point that the scandal was related to the very senior one member of the family, and his sons and grandsons completely turned the business around and weren't involved in any wrongdoing, any financial impropriety. Once the business came to London, it was kind of behind that. And that's important to mention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, your Elliston's books include 82 pages of colour plates. Philip, how did you decide what visual material to include?
It was a long process. The largest part of my personal collection is Elliston's items, probably. So I do have a lot to draw on. I had already considered doing a kind of picture book on Elliston's. I think it would come out of Patrick Fry, our discussions about that. But I decided that it would be better to write the full history and select the best. 82 plates is a lot for a relatively short book, so I did include quite a lot. But I wanted to include things that people would remember, people who remembered the company growing up. So I've included sort of catalogue pages from 10 years apart, so that hopefully most people would find something that chimed with them if they remembered the company personally. And similarly, the products, I tried to get a good age range on those. And then I've also included everything that's really surprising that they manufactured, because they didn't just do jokes and novelties. They had lots of these funny sidelines. They had like cigarette rolling machines, and they had, what did they have? They had a very early factory making vinyl, like squeezy toys for babies. They had all sorts of weird things that are quite entertaining and quite strange. And so I just tried to include as much as possible.
You published the books in a limited edition of 100 copies each, which came with a custom-made reproduction Elliston's postal box, hand-stitched by a traditional box maker in Sheffield. Philip, how do you determine how many copies of a book to print?
It's a very imprecise science. It's not straightforward, and I don't always get it right, I have to say. I think with the Elliston's book, I felt it was quite a niche thing within the magic history world. And I thought 100, because I wanted to do hardbacks as well, 100 was a good balance of it being cheap enough to print that I didn't have to price the books too high, and also would mean that I think everyone who was seriously interested would get a copy of the first edition hardback. And I possibly will do a paperback that includes both editions in one in the future. And then that's also why I really wanted to make the hardback special and this, box and everything, so that there was a real point of difference between those and any future softback edition. But no, I think 100 is a good number. It's certainly in the UK for magic history, and it allows anyone who's really passionate about it to get one in the time that they're in stock, I think. Although I have to say, I did 100 of this masculine book, the most recent publication. There's 8 of those left, and that's only been out for maybe a month or 2, I think. So that has gone very quickly, which is not ideal, but it's part of the learning about, what's more popular, what's less popular. I think in retrospect, I would have done 200, which isn't that many more, really. I think there is still a field that's quite small if you're doing things that are quite specialist. If I did a Houdini book, I'd be able to print 1,000, but I'm not that interested in doing another Houdini book. So I still have to want to write the book or want to make the book to be able to do it. And that might mean that it has a smaller market than it could have,
You recently published the collected writings of John Neville Maskelyne, which includes material published over a span of 40 years. Now, you'd previously published facsimile copies of Maskelyne's books, Sharps and Flats, and Modern Spiritualism. What prompted you to publish the collected writings?
In my head, it's all one project, really. So I did reprint the 5 core Hoffman books quite early on in the company. And after that, I thought, what's a logical next step? And Maskelyne was the thing that came to mind because he's arguably the most significant figure in British magic history, or certainly one of them. And there's some very good books written about his various theatres, but not a great deal written about him. And I feel part of that is to do with how difficult it is to get the material. So I looked into the logistics of printing everything he'd done. And if you were doing it in one book, it was very difficult to include Modern Spiritualism and Sharps and Flats because of the huge page count of them and how physically small they are, the page sizes. So to do a facsimile in the bigger book would make the book too big to hold. So I thought, well, let's get those 2 out the way. And I started with Modern Spiritualism, which is extremely hard to get hold of. So I thought, well, that's a good thing to have out there anyway. So I did a hardback of that. And then Sharps and Flats has been reprinted quite a few times. And it's also available fairly easily as first and second editions of the original book. So I didn't want to do a hardback of that, but I did want to do an affordable edition of that. So I thought, well, I'll get those 2 out of the way, and then the main body of work that's from other sources would fit in one large book. And so it was kind of I'd already decided before I printed any of Maskelyne's stuff that it would end with this larger book that had some of his shorter booklets and articles from different newspapers and magazines that he wrote, or interviews with him as well.
What challenges did you face in organising and presenting 40 years of such varied material?
It wasn't easy. The first challenge was getting the material. So I did a thorough literature search, and I say in the foreword to the book that it can't be complete. That's why it says collected, because there almost inevitably will be things that I haven't found and that other people haven't found. But I've certainly referenced every other list of his articles, of his publications. And I think I found 2 additional ones that I don't think anyone else had spotted. But that just made me even more certain that there must be more. But then it was getting the material, which was very difficult for certain things. I was very generously helped by some collectors and loaned some pieces. And there was a very lucky buy with the appendix to Maskelyne's Supernatural. There's a book called The Supernatural that had an appendix that was just written by Maskelyne that he published separately. And that is extremely rare. And it's about how the Georgia Magnet did her tricks. And I bought a book for stock. I bought that Supernatural book for stock, and it was just slipped in the back of it. And apart from going to New York and getting Houdini's copy, that was the only other way of getting a copy. So that was very fortunate. And that was the only one that I couldn't access in any way apart from getting a physical copy. So I was very fortunate with that one.
Excellent. It's a great book. As you know, I own a copy.
Thank you.
I got in early there. Your first book was, as I understand, the only biography ever published about Ernest Sewell. For people who don't know, who was he? And again, what drew you to telling his story?
Well, Ernest Sewell in the UK would be best known as a manufacturer. Well, I don't think people knew he manufactured these sets, but as a face on a magic set, essentially. So the biggest selling magic set from the 1940s right the way through the 1960s would have been the Ernest Sewell Cabinet of Conjuring Tricks, which came in a variety of variations and sizes. And I was drawn to him because, much like Elliston's, he was the start of many people's magic careers and interest in magic. And yet, again, very little known or written about him. And he's quite an unusual character in that he was a professional magician and a very successful professional magician for his whole career, right up until the year before he died. And yet he didn't really interact with the magic community. So that's where this lack of information comes from, I think. He was a member of Will Goldson's Magicians Club when he was very young. But after that, he didn't seem to engage much with the community. And yet he was this very successful concert party performer. He did annual seasons at all of the seaside resorts in these very successful concert parties. And he even was probably the first magician to be broadcast on the radio. It was an internal radio experiment which he was involved in. And then later he became a magician on the radio as well. Although he wasn't working as a magician, he was working as a comedian then as well. So he did these sort of cross-talk comedy bits. Yeah, long story short, I think he was hugely influential to young magicians, both in terms of the number of people he performed to and the fact that he had this huge magic set company producing good quality sets. And yet, if you looked up the name Ernest Sewell in any of the normal British standard books on the history of magic, you won't find him.
Well, your biography traces Sewell's journey from leaving school at 14 to joining the printing industry through to becoming a BBC radio star and, of course, a successful entrepreneur. How did you piece together his career trajectory, given how little contact he appeared to have with the magic community?
It was turning to the concert party side was the main key. So although he wasn't in the magic magazines, he was in things like Variety and other more standard entertainment magazines, entertainment newspapers. And that was very helpful. Plus, I mentioned earlier my use of newspaper archives with Australia, but the British Newspaper Archive has a lot of these local newspapers, particularly Brighton and Bournemouth and places that he performed that were, well-known seaside sort of places for this kind of entertainment. So that was a good place to go for specific dates. And actually, I do tell a lie earlier about the magic history books not mentioning him. There is one quite significant one, which is Eddie Dawes' book on Stanley Collins, that does mention him because he did publish a couple of Stanley Collins' books, and he was a junior member in one of Collins's seaside concert parties as well. So there was some connections there to go at. But again, very little in the magic press.
Just a reminder that you can be notified when new episodes of this podcast are published by subscribing to the email alerts. You'll find all the details on the podcast website at themagicbookpodcast.com, which is where you can also find transcripts plus accompanying blog posts with summaries, timestamps, and links to resources mentioned in each episode. Philip, when we were preparing for this podcast, you mentioned that magic history publishing is particularly challenging. Now, you don't wholesale your publications to dealers. What's the thinking behind this direct-to-consumer approach?
It's mainly cost. It would be prohibitively expensive for me to publish more niche or specialist books and leave a margin for a wholesaler to stock them. So it wouldn't be possible without essentially doubling the retail price of the books. And I think I hadn't foreseen the international nature of the bookshop. I think I send about half of my stock overseas now, which is not something that I'd expected. So initially it just made a lot of sense to sell direct, as I was mainly posting within the UK. That's changed, but thankfully coinciding with that change, Royal Mail, the service I use, have also decreased their large parcel prices significantly. There is conflicting things, but still the logic I try to use is if someone in America, for instance, so America, as a side note, is the most expensive place in the world to send to, apart from Australia. And that's within America, that pricing, rather than getting it there. So like Royal Mail have World Zone 1, World Zone 2, and World Zone 3 brackets America. So that's World Zone 3 is just America. They have their own pricing. But even with that, if I sold to a wholesaler and they took their cut, it would still be cheaper for me to post the book directly to America for the consumer than it would be for them to buy from their local magic shop. And me have had to sell it to them with me making a margin, the wholesaler making a margin, and the magic shop making a margin.
Now that you handle rare and historically significant magic books daily, has it changed your relationship with collecting them personally?
I think it has. I think it came in one day, I'd say. Very early in the shop growing, I purchased a collection from a magic historian and a magic publisher, actually. Well, actually, he ran a printing firm that published many magic publishers' books. And it was a very large archive material that all came in at once. And it was the first real time that books that aligned with what I collect came in bulk. Because I'm personally quite strict on what I keep. I don't keep any instructional material after 1960 unless it's got a particular meaning to something I'm researching. I keep all the history stuff I do tend to keep. But no, I think that when they came in, it was like, A, I need to reshelve my personal collection. And B, I need to make some very strict rules that I keep to about when lots come in, what's for the shop and what's for me. So yes, it's made me a lot more picky, and it's made me think a lot more seriously about what I will be researching for the rest of my life. Basically, I don't want to rule out areas of research by ruling out types of book, basically. So I try and view my library as a research library for my own projects rather than it being a set of collectibles that might have a value for financial means.
Well, this is the Magic Book Podcast. So, Philip, what is your most cherished magic book and why?
That's a really, really, really difficult question. Yes, I'm sure it's probably what everyone says. And can I have two? Is that allowed?
Yes.
Okay. I think the first one would be, I've got Chung Lin Su's personal copy of Drawing Room Conjuring by Hoffman. And it's a very tatty copy. And I don't know whether that's happened since he had it or whether that happened when he had it. I like to imagine it happened when he had it, and that it got so tatty. And that I suspect it was because it's got the stamps from being sold at the auction after his death in London. So I suspect that whoever had it has since then has cherished it much like I do. But then I don't know because I got it again by pure chance. I bought the copy on its own just for stock. And then I looked inside and was like, oh gosh, this is his copy. So that's one. I think because of the connection there's something about the idea that he may have, especially as it was from the publishing the period when he lived in America as well, when he was, he was American obviously, but it feels like it's a real significant thing for him. Perhaps not. He might have picked it up a week before he dies at a secondhand bookshop. Who knows? But that's one. And the other I just got very recently is one of Eddie Dawes' own copies of The Great Illusionists, his book, which was the first magic book for an adult audience that I read as a boy and I've always really loved and referred back to. And yeah, recently one of his friends very kindly sold it to me. So that's very special for me.
I think that was a gateway for many of us.
Yes, yeah.
So interesting. You mentioned Hay on Wye. I can't overemphasize what an amazing place Hay on Wye is, because one of the books in my collection, which indeed was from the Sue collection, because it also has that little purple stamp in front. I believe I purchased it in Hay on Wye.
Fantastic.
But I think I also paid quite a lot for it at the time.
Oh, yes.
Philip, what's on the horizon? Do you have any new publishing projects that you can share with us?
Yes. The first is a book on the Strand magazine, which was a general interest magazine published from the 1890s through to 1950s here in the UK. And it was also published in America. There was an American version. And that included a great deal of magic-related content written by magicians, interviews with magicians, tricks and things like that. Maskelyne's in there, Houdini wrote for them, and David Devant wrote an awful lot for them. It's just a very difficult set of magazines to look through. They're huge, they're physically very big, and a lot of it's available digitally, but again, there's not a good way of searching it. So I actually have built a spreadsheet over the years for myself on referring to the Strand. And I thought this could be well organised, printed and created with a proper full index and all this. So yes, it's a simple, small guide for the Strand magazine and just aims to cut down the amount of work that researchers have to do when they've got that niggling doubt. Oh, was that in the Strand or was it not? They can just quickly go to the index and it'll tell them whether or not it is. And it also comes with a couple of little cards that you can slip in your wallet. So when you are out book shopping, And there's a whole shelf of strands there. You don't have to go through the index in every single one. You can just take your little card out your pocket and go, okay, volume 45, page 30, that's got an article in. And you can choose whether or not to buy the book.
Collectors everywhere are going to love that.
I hope so. Yeah. And then there's another book that will be out probably next year. That's the next book that I'm writing as an author, rather than it being an editorial or being printed as a reprint. And that's going to be a in-depth history on the very, very early years through to the sort of 1950s of the British joke shop industry, British joke suppliers, which obviously has many crossovers with magic shops and magic factories and things. So that's the long-term project that should be coming out next year, possibly the year after.
Okay, well, we'll look out for that. For listeners interested in exploring magic history through books, what advice would you give about building a collection?
That's tricky. I think have focus, try and decide where you want to specialize. I think I've gradually come to the realization that I'm not going to invest a huge amount of time investigating American magicians. And so I have stopped sort of religiously buying everything to do with that. And I am concentrating much more on British and European stuff, which is easier for me to get hold of too. I think if you're building from scratch, start with some really good general magic history books from around the world, like get Eddie Dawes' Great Illusionists, get Milbourne Christopher's Picture History of Magic, or I think it's had a few names for them, and also the Illustrated History of Magic. I always get his titles confused because he's got two that have very similar names, don't they? But those are brilliant and very easy to get hold of, and maybe see what tickles your fancy in there, see what really interests you, and then look at what's available. I think you can build a really good magic history collection without starting to buy the really special deluxe volumes and things. You know, they're really interesting, they're really good, but I'd wait till you have a good general library first, because you could get, 10 general history books for the price of one sometimes when you're looking at the very rare, very specialist biographies. Also, don't invest all your money in Houdini books. They're really easy to get hold of. There's hundreds of them out there. There's 2 more produced a year probably. And I absolutely love Houdini. I love reading about Houdini, but let's concentrate on some of the magicians for a while.
I'm curious, Philip, has your background working as a conservator in museums and historic buildings influenced your approach to handling and preserving magic books and ephemera, or indeed your interest in the social history surrounding, as we've talked about, everyday working magicians?
Yeah, I say both. Starting with the first point about handling, it's mainly storage. I think that it's affected them most. I think it's really important to store your books correctly. It's really important to inspect your books. Don't leave shelves of books unlooked at for years, because you may get damp, you may get all sorts of air circulation issues, and you just want to catch things early when it comes to those things. One of the most common misconceptions is that you won't get damp books if your house isn't damp, and that's not true. If there's air that's just staying unmoving behind shelves of books, you will get damp there. So little things like that, always inspect your stuff. And when you're storing booklets and things, don't get drawn in too much to plastic sleeves, because again, you're trapping air in there, you're trapping humidity in there. I mean, they're all good to use as long as you've got a good routine of checking stuff. So that's the first part. I think the second point about the social history is, very important. I do think, one of the first things you learn when you train as a conservator is that the financial value of the object in front of you is completely irrelevant. It's all about what it can teach you and what it can teach people in the future. You're conserving it so that academics who have not yet been born, or people who are interested in the field that have not yet been born, can get information from this item. And I think I've taken that across into magic. The way I often see it, there's kind of 2 parallel markets when you look at these big magic auctions. There's the things that are obviously of value, have an autograph of a famous magician, or, a piece of well-documented catalogued rare magic apparatus made by one well-known company, or, 10-year items, for instance. They're a modern example. But what do they teach you about magic history? Very, very little. While as a scrapbook put together by an amateur magician will tell you a huge amount potentially, or a catalogue from an obscure firm. Those things often, even if they've got a fraction of the financial value of a signature of Chung Ling Soo or a postcard of Chung Ling Soo, which you can find reprinted in every biography of him, which is worth hundreds and hundreds of pounds, I mean, not that either is wrong. I think they're both valid. But I think for me, the thing that appeals to me is getting more information, creating, like for myself, an archive of stuff that I can use to do research rather than speculate on it increasing in value, for instance, or things like that. They're not priorities for me.
If listeners would like to learn more about your pre-owned and exclusive new publications, what's the best way to do so?
The newsletter, probably. We've got a newsletter that goes out about once a week. If you just go on the homepage and scroll to the bottom, you can sign up to the newsletter there. And also in the same place, there's our Instagram, our Facebook and our YouTube channels. Yeah, they're the best ways, I think.
Excellent. Philip, thank you so much for being my guest on the Magic Book Podcast.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Magic Book Podcast. In this episode, we explored Philip David Treece's journey from magic enthusiast to conservation expert to magic bookseller and publisher. We learned about his work documenting important but often overlooked aspects of magic history, from the story of Ellisdons to the collected writings of John Neville Maskelyne. Philip also shared valuable insights about the challenges and rewards of magic history publishing and offered advice for collectors. His commitment to preserving and sharing magic's printed heritage helps ensure these important stories and resources remain available for future generations. You'll find the transcript accompanying this episode on the website at themagicbookpodcast.com, plus a blog post with a summary, timestamps and links to resources we mentioned. If you have a question or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please contact me, Adrian at themagicbookpodcast.com. Thanks for listening to the Magic Book Podcast. I've been your host, Adrian Tennant. Until next time, goodbye.